everyone. It's my pleasure to welcome you this evening to the York Festival of Ideas. My name is Duncan Petrie. I'm the Dean of Arts and Humanities at the University of York. And it's a great pleasure to be here this evening, and great to see that so many of you have managed to drag yourself away from that fabulous weather out there for a bit of entertainment. So in a moment, I'll introduce our speaker, John Higgs. John is an author who specialises in finding previously unsuspected narratives hidden in obscure corners of our history and culture, which can change the way we see the world. He's written on a wide variety of topics, including William Blake, the KLF, the Beatles. He's written about the 20th century, he's written about the 21st century, and he's also written about the past. And tonight he's going to be talking about his most recent book, Exterminate, Regenerate, the Story of Doctor Who. Before turning to full-time writing, John directed over 100 episodes of animated preschool television. He created the long-running BBC Radio 4 quiz series X Marks the Spot, and he worked as a producer on a number of video games for the Xbox, PlayStation 2, and Nintendo GameCube. So we're absolutely delighted that he's here tonight to talk about the story of Doctor Who. So without any further ado, please let me introduce John Higgs.
Thanks, Duncan. Thanks very much. Hello, can you all hear me okay? Is that all working? Nodding heads, you're all good? Lovely. Thank you all for coming on such a really beautiful day. It's a really wonderful day. As Duncan says, I'm the author of this book, a book on Doctor Who, a book on 60 years of a fiction. And I guess there was one incident in particular that made me think, hey, there's something quite interesting about this character, not just as of itself, but how it's evolved and changed and fitted into our society and affected people and sort of behaved in a way that other fictional characters don't. And that incident was about in 2007 when, as Duncan said, I used to work making preschool animation, sort of cheap little milkshake cartoons for Channel 5. Which was fun, which is a fun job. And you'd hire some actors. And being me, I'm obviously going to try and hire this man. And by a wonderful fluke of circumstances, it just so happened that he'd been living in France and was bored to tears. And he'd arranged with his wife that, yes, they can move back to England on proviso that he gets out the house a lot. So we could afford him. For that reason, we could afford him. And he was a narrator for about 65 episodes of this program called The Beeps. And would record his lines, and then, being Tom, we'd go to a pub in Soho, and we were at a place called the Yorkshire Grey. And the bar was sort of goes round a corner. So I'm standing with Tom Baker at this bar, and I'm just in the perfect position to see a guy who was sort of stood by the bar over there. So we had a pint of lager, and it was a Wednesday afternoon. And it was like the most mundane sort of Wednesday that you can sort of imagine. And I was just happened to see him at the exact moment that he looked up and turned his phone off. At the exact moment, he looked up and saw Tom Baker was in the pub. And the thing that crossed over his face at that moment, I'm still slightly haunted by, really. I still think about it to this day. It wasn't just a look of, he wasn't just pleased to see him. He wasn't just sort of surprised. It wasn't like, oh, there's that guy who used to be on the telly in the 1970s. It was a look of genuine awe, right? And it's not until you see a look of genuine awe that you realise there's not a lot of awe about. It was kind of as if that mundane Wednesday had just fallen away and he'd like stepped into Narnia and his world had changed. I thought, wow, if a fictional character can do that to someone, then they kind of matter. We could do a lot more of that sort of thing in our lives. In our lives we have, our friends, and we have our family, and we have our work colleagues. And we also have fictional characters. And they're not real, but they're not nothing, are they? Especially ones that are in our lives for decades. Especially ones that sort of bring the family together in a cross-generational way, in a way that very few things do these days. The notion of things that are shared with your children or your grandparents, and the kids actually coming out of the bedroom and their screens to sort of join in this sort of family storytelling. It's very, very rare. And I started to realise that because Doctor Who's kind of, well, it's always there. It's always around, isn't it? It's a very easy thing to take for granted. But I think it's a lot more extraordinary than we generally give it credit for. And I think one reason for that is, this is Ian Fleming with James Bond on the set of Doctor No. This is kind of how we imagine fictional characters are created, especially ones that impact on the culture, big, important things that hit a nerve, and are talked about for generations. We think there's an Ian Fleming or a J.K. Rowling or an Arthur Conan Doyle. There's like this brilliant genius creator who defines, exactly what that character is, but at the same time defines exactly what they're not, And so people who come along afterwards, like when people write James Bond books now, they always talk about, going back to Fleming, and like Fleming's books have a certain status that, other later writers don't have. That didn't happen with Doctor Who. There was no single creator. It just kind of emerged out of a series of memos and meetings and a sort of a need to fill a schedule, a scheduling hole, the need to find something to go between Grandstand, which the dads watched, and Jukebox Jury, which the kids watched. Had to find something to fit into that. So it wasn't a thing that just sort of emerged out of, in a moment of inspiration, and someone saw this sort of wonderful character and goes. It was much more a sort of a problem to be solved. If you look at the early memos, I don't think this will be readable because it's not that legible. But this is when they're trying to work out what this program could be. And at the top they talk about the handsome young man hero. That's the first character. That would be a character called Ian. And then there's a handsome, well-dressed heroine, and that's the second character. That's the character who became Barbara, and that was the core of the series. And then, not so much as an afterthought, it's just this odd thing. It's like the maturer man, 35 to 40, with some character twist. That's not a character design, is it? That's a desire for a character. It's like a space where a character could be. And because no one really defined what it was, and no one really defined what it wasn't, people have been able to sort of pass it around from writer to writer to showrunner, and they've all just gone, I'm just going to make this my own. I'm just going to completely own it. I'm just going to do what I want with this in a way that you can't do with a lot of other characters. So it's the way it's sort of changed over time is unusual, and it's very odd. And I think it's a trickster, basically. If you look into trying to define what the character is, here's a few tricksters from sort of history. A trickster is, well, obviously they're playful and mischievous. They often they like disguises. They can change their appearance. They can change their gender. They often steal like a magical thing from the gods, or a time machine from the Time Lords. And they're boundary dwellers. They cross boundaries that normal people can't cross, like the boundaries of, time and space. And they basically descend from the heavens to our world, upturn it, and clear off. Right? That's the sort of behaviour of a trickster. But they're not goodies. They're not good guys. They're just a force for change. They don't really care whether it's for good or bad. Except when they're on TV, a weird little thing happens. That's Marvel's version of Loki in the middle. And, in the films, he's a trickster. He's not really a goodie, but he's not really a baddie. He's just this strange, other thing. The moment they put him into his own TV series, he's like trying to save his friends and just, acting for the greater good, and things like that the tricksters don't really do. Bugs Bunny is another great example. In a small cartoon, they're absolutely this trickster spirit. But you put them in a longer thing like Space Jam, and they're behaving like a regular protagonist, and it's quite odd. And the thing is, it's because they love disguises. They can't change. It's impossible for a trickster to become something else. A trickster's always a trickster, but they can disguise themselves. They can put on the mask of a hero, if that's going to work in that circumstances. But underneath the mask, right, there's something a lot more tricksy is under there. And you see it a lot in Doctor Who, usually after a regeneration, after a change. And if you think about what happened in 1966, it's a good example of that, because what happened here, 3 years into the programme, was kind of weird, was kind of odd. Obviously, the series started in 1963 with William Hartnell, the first Doctor. And the character, as I say, wasn't really that well defined. But Hartnell was a very mercurial, changeable sort of character. And if you look into his history, his childhood was such a almost Dickensian, story of neglect and things that you can quite understand why he was like he was in later life. He was spiky. He could be spiky. He could be scary. But at the same time, he could just turn and be sweet and lovely. And that changeable, mercurial aspect of William Hartnell, he sort of gave to this character. And it's sort of been there ever since. It's outlived Hartnell. It's become almost immortal, really, surviving in the heart of this character. And he loved it. He loved being Doctor Who. One of my favourite stories of him is about he was in his car, and the traffic was stopped, and there was a traffic cop just up ahead, sort of stopping the traffic. And he got out of his car, and he marched up to the cop, and he goes, "Don't you know who I am? I'm Doctor Who. I'm Doctor Bloody Who." And he was, he was Doctor Bloody Who, and he sort of always will be, and he wanted to always be it, because he'd finally found a role in life that sort of connected him to his inner child again. It sort of made him happy in a way he hadn't been for that so long. But alas, life being what it is, issues of ill health in particular, meant that the BBC made this decision to recast, to get rid of Hartnell, who wanted to do it forever. And if they'd stayed, we wouldn't be talking about Doctor Who now. The fact that they recast is what made this thing live for decades and decades and decades. But it was an odd way they went about it, because normally, if you're recasting a TV show, it happens a fair bit. You get an actor who's, a bit like the original actor, and they do their take on the same character. That's how it normally works. What they don't do is go, well, we'll just get someone who's like completely different, and they can do it being completely different. But we'll just say they're the same person, It's a really odd choice, and I think a lot of it to do was the pace of change in the 1960s was, extraordinary. The notion that, a lead actor could have his hair as long as that would have been unthinkable in 1963. But then in 1966, it would have been unthinkable to have this sort of patriarchal sort of authority figure as the lead thing. The Beatles' mop top was a sense that they were changing to sort of fit in with the world as the world was changing. And change is kind of at the heart of Patrick Troughton, really. If you know, one thing people might know about him is his personal life was, I think, unorthodox is probably the word we're sort of looking for. He basically had, he had 2 partners and 2 sets of children in 2 houses in 2 parts of London, and kept it secret while he was Doctor Who. The press behaved very differently in those days. It was secret to the extent that every Christmas he'd go to his mother's with his first wife and their children, and they'd all act like nothing unusual had happened. And his mum, died not knowing she had all these other grandchildren. It was sort of kept that secret, and that was only part of the complicated web of girlfriends and emotional and romantic relationships that made up Patrick Troughton's life. And his son, from his first wife, Michael Troughton, the fine actor, very fine actor, he didn't see a lot of his dad growing up, but he did get to go on holiday with him, which he writes about in his book about his dad. And he got to ask his dad, why? Why'd you behave like this? And Patrick Troughton just looked at him and said, I need change. Like, things have to change all the time for me, I'm afraid. That's just the way I am. I'm sorry if I hurt you. This utter horror of like stasis and life remaining the same was the part of Troughton that he then imprinted on this character, on this fictional character that's again remained there always to this day. And to the extent that on his first episode of Power of the Daleks, he says to his companion Polly, life depends on change and renewal, and that's Troughton just imprinting himself on this character. And this is the pattern that sort of continues. When we say it changes, it kind of does and it doesn't. By the time you get to the 1970s, and it goes into colour, every single thing about the original format, including its most unique selling point, the idea that they can go anywhere in time and space, right? Everything about it had gone. It had been binned. He was now stuck on Earth. He was exiled to Earth. And Verity Lambert, the first producer of Doctor Who, she just couldn't believe it. For her, the character was like working for the establishment, for the military establishment, this great outsider character that she'd helped be. It was everything, as she saw, had changed about it. And yet it was still the same. Yet it's still the same thing. And it's kind of odd, and it kind of helps, I think, if you think about yourself. When you were a child, when you were younger, obviously you looked different. You were a different height, you were a different weight, you had a different haircut. You would have different, opinions, different beliefs, different prejudices, different ideas. Even physically the same thing. Every cell that made up your sort of younger self has died and, been replaced, probably countless times, It's very hard to say materially why that thing, that child, is the same as that adult, And I think it's because our identity, our sense of self, is really a story. We're a story. And that was the beginning of the story. So yes, of course we're that. We're the same story as that child. We're the same sort of continuation. And with Doctor Who, this was the same continuation of how it started. Because our minds love story, right? We're kind of like story addicts, really. We say we're not, but we kind of are. If we get home from work and we've got some precious free time, we go, probably going to go on Netflix or go on a box set or sort of read a book or watch a film or even when you're scrolling through social media, you're sort of, you're following events to what happened to certain characters. We're getting a storytelling fix. we're sort of eager for a storytelling fix. And, you know, religions are kind of stories, political parties are stories. You know, a 90-minute game of football is often a better story than a prize-winning novel, you know. So what our brains do is when they're confronted by the vast, chaotic, bewildering, you know, excess of everything, they just go, I'm just going to cut that down and say these things are important, those things aren't important, and I'm going to turn it into a narrative and turn it into a story. So that's about our brains are essentially... Now, why don't I throw this in the bin? So there we go. Flight mode. Sorry, so we're kind of addicts. And suddenly you've got this wonderful storytelling, you know, machine that keeps coming up with story after story after story. And it's, you know, in a couple of episodes ago, you know, the program finally identified itself for the first time as a never-ending story, you know, which it is, it absolutely is. And it's all because of the one thing that never changes. I said earlier that everything changes, but there was one fixed thing, which is the exterior of the police box. Only the most minor changes over the decades. You know, it's always instantly sort of recognisable. Because those doors... those are the doors to the other world. They're the doors to everywhere. There's the doors you step to go through and find another story, another adventure. And it's a key part, if you look at British myth, and Irish myth as well, and Japanese, but not in a lot of places, not of other places. So much of our storytelling, our mythic storytelling, is based around this concept of the other world, which is... another place that you can just sort of fall into by, you know, stepping through the wardrobe into Narnia, or going down the rabbit hole into Wonderland, or getting to platform 9 3/4, or the Mist's part in its Brigadoon, and, you know, and you find this world that's just wonderful, right? That's exciting. It's sort of thrilling, but it's only as you're there, you slowly realise there's a darkness there as well. The darkness will slowly sort of reveal itself. And time is funny. You know, if you go there for a day, you can come back and you've been gone for a year. And it keeps reappearing in our storytelling, from Tir na Nog in the Irish myths to Avalon, the land of the apple trees, and to Wonderland, it's in A Midsummer Night's Dream. We just keep repeating it. It's not, our myths aren't like origin myths like the Greeks, or end of time myths like Ragnarok with the Norse. Our myths are always just, could be around at any particular point. We could just fall into them. So we keep renewing them, keep recreating them. And so, when Britain entered the TV age, of course there was going to be, you know, a portal to the other world there. And it's not the underworld, which is the land of the dead, which is where most countries' myths are. It's the other world. It's the land of the ever young. It's this sort of glorious sort of storytelling opportunity. And it's not like this wardrobe which just takes you to Narnia, or that rabbit hole that just takes you to Wonderland. It takes you to everywhere and anywhere. And as a result, it's produced so many stories over the years. We've had, it's probably about 890 episodes by now, 890 something, and there's been well over 1,000 audio adventures on Big Finish, and then you've got all the comics, and then you've got all the books, and then you've got the BBC audios, and there's been plays, and there's been video games. It's just this absolute tsunami of adventure, of fiction, of narrative, far in excess of anything that any TV-created character has produced. I don't think there's anyone alive who could have experienced every single official Doctor Who story. And this is before you get to the unofficial ones. This is before you get to the world of fan fiction, and all the fanzines and all that sort of stuff. It's got so much. It's become so big. I've started to wonder if the word fiction isn't quite right, and maybe we need a name like mega-fiction to describe it, because it's behaving in a way that stories normally don't. And there's often a thing that scale or complexity affects the fundamental nature of something in a sudden phase shift where, something is easily understandable and behaves itself, and then it reaches a sort of point in size and suddenly it's different. And, hydrogen is obviously a good example. It's just an odorless, colourless gas. Unless you get so much of it together, then suddenly there's a phase shift and it's like this blazing star, and the mud in the ground it's just matter, it's just earth. Until it gets a certain level of complexity, then you've got life there. And life reaches a certain level of complexity and it becomes aware, it becomes conscious, it has an imagination. An imagination, once it reaches a certain level of complexity, it starts creating these fictional characters. And you start to wonder, well, what happens to fictional characters when they get sufficiently complex, when they reach a certain scale? And I think this is why Doctor Who, as I say, doesn't quite behave like a nice little fiction should, right? A good example of this was when it was coming to the end of the Jodie Whittaker years, a few years ago. And there's a lot of talk about, well, this is probably the end of it. There isn't anyone obvious to take it over. It's also problematic for the BBC because of charter changes. They were no longer allowed to make it themselves. They had to put their internally created things out to tender to private companies. And they could sort of fudge it with a company called BBC Studios, which was, technically not them. But really, they were expected by the government to give it to a private company, for a fiction, for a TV program, for a character, they need writers, and they need actors, and they need a company to sort of make it. And most fictions would just sort of passively sort of sit back and hope that these things turn up. But what Doctor Who did was kind of odd, because suddenly there was the writer, Russell T Davies came back. Suddenly there was the actor, there was David Tennant, he came back. But both of those were a writer or an actor because the programme had made them one in the first place. David Tennant was 3 when he saw John Pertwee turn into Tom Baker, and it blew his mind, and he had to speak to his parents about it, and he learned at that point about the existence of things called actors, and at that point he knew what he wanted to be. He always says that Doctor Who made him an actor, and Russell T Davies will always talk about how Doctor Who made him a writer. A lot of writers say the same. Stephen Moffat will say exactly the same sort of thing. But it went further than that. Remember in the Christopher Eccleston series, there was this TV company in the future called Bad Wolf, and Billie Piper's character sort of inhaled the time vortex, and she took the name of this company, Bad Wolf, and she scattered it throughout time and space, leaving a trail that paradoxically led her back to where she was, and all that sort of stuff. It was just a thing that existed in fiction. A TV company that existed in fiction. But a decade later, the executives behind this series, Jane Tranter, Julie Gardner, they set up their own company, and they decided that no, they'd manifest Bad Wolf. They'd make it exist in the real world. So they set up Bad Wolf. And so you reach the point where this programme needs a non-BBC company to make it. And it's made one. It's created one itself. And it's set in Cardiff where the skill set is and everything. So it created the company, and it created the actor, and it created the writer that it needed to survive. This is very advanced things, evolutionary speaking. It's called niche creation, evolutionary speaking. The idea isn't that a species will just go into a territory and find everything they need to flourish. What happens is a species will go into a territory and it will start acting in that territory, and by doing so it will change things, and it will change the world to make it suitable for itself to survive. Right? this is kind of advanced stuff for a story to be doing. In theory, it's only living things can do this, right? And that sort of makes sense. But if you look at what the definition of a living thing is, it's not very clear-cut, and there's lots of arguments about it. It's obvious sort of things. A thing needs to sort of move and grow and change and consume and survive and things like that. It never usually says, oh yeah, and they also, have to exist. They have to be real, I think they assume that. I think that's sort of taken for read. It can sound very weird saying that, like, the story, like a character like Doctor Who, is behaving in the way that a living thing does. It's very weird to say that a fiction is alive, It's much better to say it just behaves as if it is alive, right, which it sort of does. That always sounds a lot better, unless you try and work out what the difference is between something that's alive and something that just acts like it's alive. That's always the tricky one. That's always the problematic one. So there's this series it's sort of created around it this sort of network of relationships, this sort of Whovian industrial complex built up of fans that have been inspired by it, who have set up audio companies or magazines or conventions, or the whole sort of world that sort of envelops it and sort of kind of protects it, and sort of helps it sort of live and survive and protect it from attacks from people like Michael Grade, or the sort of attacks it's getting now is a good example, because now it's a very, very tricky time. For a TV series to keep going, it has to adapt to the changing culture and the changing entertainment ecosystem. Right? These are all very, very choppy waters at the moment. You've probably seen a lot of reports in the media about this absolute, crisis in British drama, where because ratings of everything have just collapsed and costs have just skyrocketed up, a British story, a British drama, just cannot get made now unless it also appeals overseas, unless it appeals to the Americans or something like that, or put in enough money to get it made. Things like the thing about the post office, the ITV series about the post office, would not get made now because it has no international sort of... It's an absolute massive crisis, and the industry is absolutely freaked out. But for Doctor Who, you might think, well, that's going to be watched overseas, so it might be all right, But it's not. It's never mainstream anywhere else. It's always just this sort of cult thing. I think it's just basically a bit too mad for the rest of the world. They like things like Paddington, right? That works internationally. And there's something about that sort of, polite reasonableness that you get in Paddington that they sort of want from England in particular. But it's not us, is it? We're not. It's part of us. That's an aspect of who we are. But who we are really is, I think, a lot more wilder and a lot more crazier than you'd expect from, Downton Abbey or Paddington or something like that. I think it's because, as I say, this character didn't have a single creator. You've just had dozens and dozens of actors and writers and directors coming and sort of imprinting themselves on it, giving parts of themselves to this character, sometimes giving too much, and they're never quite the same, again. And so it's become this sort of crowd-sourced archetype, this sort of, this fiction that's parts of so many other people that it can't help but get a sort of a wider sort of imprint of this island, of the people on this island. It's a tricky one for international sales, and so the whole thing with Disney is, and this is before you get to the whole cultural changes at the moment, because anyone remember when Kemi Badenoch announced she was going to stand for leader of the Conservative Party? She put out this video on social media to announce that she was standing. And in the video, her argument for why she should be leader of the Conservative Party was, "I'm not afraid of Doctor Who." And it was just that. It wasn't like, oh, here's my economic policies and here's my thoughts on foreign affairs. Oh, and by the way, I'm not afraid of Doctor Who. It was just, I'm not afraid of Doctor Who, by which she meant David Tennant, who, as a parent of a trans child, had criticised her. So she was, in her head, she was fighting back against this. And if you watch Doctor Who, it's kind of hard to hear someone say, "I'm not afraid of Doctor Who," without seeing them as some like evil supervillain whose plans are going to fall horribly wrong in about half an hour's time. You know? But she knew she wasn't talking to people who watch Doctor Who. She was talking specifically to the voting members of the Conservative Party. And she knew they wouldn't have any truck with this nonsense, you know, this ridiculous sort of thing. There was some lovely data in the Rest is Entertainment podcast a while back, which looked at how people voted to what their favourite TV shows were. And the people who viewed themselves as progressive, they had Doctor Who as one of their favourite programme. You know, I think it was that and Blue Planet or something like that. People on the right, you know, they just didn't watch it anymore. They just thought it's not for them. You know, the attitudes or something were they just didn't get it. They just didn't like it. It was silly, but it was. I mean, you should see the press that this thing is getting. This series has had the most negative sort of media narrative around it that I can remember of any sort of series of Doctor Who. At a time when, to my eyes, it's phenomenal. It's like been a phenomenal season for me. At least that's how I've sort of enjoyed it. And the disconnect between what it is and the media reaction to it is kind of extraordinary. And this is the Sun in February saying that Ncuti Gatwa had quit. That was their story, Ncuti Gatwa had quit. If you saw the Sun a week ago, their front page headline was, Ncuti Gatwa's been sacked, right? Can't both be true. At least one must have been made up. The Sun really hates Ncuti Gatwa, right? I don't know what it is about the first black gay Doctor Who that they don't like. You'd have to ask them. It's probably the moustache, I don't know. But this really frightening sort of narrative that it's doomed, the series is doomed, it's sort of coming to an end, has been all around it, you know, in these past few months. But there's a funny thing with Doctor Who. As I say, this guy's a trickster. They're a boundary dweller. But they cross through boundaries that I aren't supposed to. And that's certainly been what's been happening in the fiction of it since the Toymaker sort of turned up and it started behaving like to the rules of play rather than the rules of narrative. The boundary between what's been on the screen, the story, and the whole world of Doctor Who beyond it has just been absolutely broken like nobody's business. It's even the trailers, they were just wandering into the wrong, you know, TV show. They were in the Traitors, you know, and then you get episodes like Lux where the animations are coming out of the screen, and then the Doctor and Belinda, they sort of come out of the telly to sort of meet some viewers, and as I say, the fourth wall's so gone, you know. The Doctor would sort of look at the camera and wink and go into a song and dance routine, you know. That guy knows they're on a TV show, you know. Mrs. Flood knows she's on a TV show. She delivers these monologues. She even started to talk about, like, oh, well, the series is coming to an end. It was like limited run, few weeks only. It's like, how is the narrative of this whole thing sort of fallen out like that? And it's got to this sort of bizarre stage. I kind of think with Russell T Davies is he knows the impact that representation, right, has on the wider society. He knows this from doing Queer as Folk back in the 90s. I don't know if you know that series, very groundbreaking series. But it was just after you know, in the 80s, there was Clause 28, and people were just being openly homophobic in the Houses of Parliament. And at that point, in the late 80s, if you'd have said, well, when that party gets back into power, they're going to legalise gay marriage, no one would have taken that remote. It was just ridiculous. It was just insane, that idea. And yet that's kind of exactly what happened. You know, culture changes, society sort of changes. And part of that was spearheaded by Russell T Davies, just putting gay characters on TV, behaving like gay characters, and people at home just going, oh, it's just some people. You know, it's not really a problem. It very much impacts that. So when he's putting, you know, a trans character on BBC One on a Saturday in a happy family, right, he knows that's not normal for TV. You don't normally see that on TV. So he knows what he's doing that. So he's very much sort of pushing that sort of thing. I think for Russell T Davies, the Doctor is something that fights the monsters both on screen and off. You know, I think he sees it as an active force for sort of societal change. You know, and and when you look back at this series and look back at this sort of narrative that, oh, this is the end, the Doctor's doomed, right? How could they survive what's happening in the world of BBC, in the world of Disney, and all that sort of stuff? You just think, hang on, this is just the cliffhanger, isn't it? The cliffhanger's just sort of spilt out into the real world. Of course they're going to survive. They always survive, you know. The question is how, and that question of how they survive is what gets you sort of mind racing. Because as a child, it would be those cliffhangers that, you know, that made you think about the programme when it wasn't on. And for a lot of people, it made them into writers because they started thinking like a writers. They go, well, I know he's going to survive, but how? And they'd sort of try and work it out. They'd come up with something, and it might even be better than what actually happened. And that was always, you know, very exciting. That sense that the programme then became something that you thought about outside of when it's on. And then when you started doing that, it kind of became part of your identity. It kind of imprinted on you a little bit. It's like, you know, sports fandom. They always talk about their team as we, you know. They'll never say they lost. It's like we lost, you know. They identify with the team. Like they and the team are pretty much the same sort of thing. Doctor Who can do that to you. And especially if you reach a point where it's not for you, and normally you just sort of drift off, you know, like it's easy to drift off long-running programmes like EastEnders or If I Got News to You, you just sort of drift away. It's hard to do that with Doctor Who. You kind of feel the need to sort of keep sort of going back to it. And it means that when a new episode's coming up, for a lot of fans, a lot of the audience, they kind of approach it not with like, oh, excitement, there's a new episode coming, but like an anxiety that like, oh no, please don't embarrass me, please don't. Because when the thing that's become part of you is this sort of like, you know, half-mad sort of children's programme made on an unhelpful budget by a lot of people who are quite mad. There's a great amount of possibility that it could all go, you know, horribly wrong and be embarrassing. So that's often the first watch. It's then after the watch it, you're safe and you can go back and see all the good things, and then you start to sort of appreciate it, and then you sort of enjoy it. That sense that, because it's part of you, because it sort of matters, and maybe part of your family and part of these things, it means more than a fictional character kind of should. And I kind of think the reason it works at Christmas is basically it's a gift, really. Right? It shouldn't exist. Yeah, if you look at the 60 years of history, it's not logical. It's not even likely. It's barely sort of plausible. These things, it shouldn't have, you know, come like this, and yet it has, and yet we have it, and we have it in our lives, you know. And as I say, it's very easy to take for granted because it's always there, and it's not crying out as being something that's important that needs, you know, academic attention or critical appraisal or you know something. It's serious people. It's too mad for them, you know. It sort of keeps them away, which is great, you know, which is really good for it. And so it just sort of goes under the radar. It's always there, and it's very easy to overlook. But when you step, which is what I hope this book sort of does, when you sort of step back and you see this sort of, it was like a space for a character, and this character just sort of appeared there, and in the gap between many minds, many different people sort of produced this thing that sort of went on to have its sort of own agency, it's become this almost evolutionary perfect storytelling machine that survives in a way that our greatest writers, can't create characters that do that, It's phenomenal. It's a phenomenal thing to happen. I think we're just very, very lucky to sort of have it in our lives. And I'm hoping that's what will come across from this book. I've done my allotted time, so I should shut up soon. But I'd be very interested in questions and things like that. In a bit, there's books, and not only there's books. If you buy a book, there's stickers and there's badges. Just saying. But before that, if anyone has any questions, I'd love to have a conversation about any of this, and I'm sure Duncan has a microphone. If any hands.
We've got 2 roving mics, and I can just about see everyone. So, does anybody have a question? Does anyone want to kick things off? Yes, there we are. A person there. So, we've got the 3rd row.
Yes.
I'm just interested in that story about Patrick Troughton and how he had 2 families. I just wonder, were his families aware of each other?
Yes, he was very open to people. He was very sort of emotionally sort of open to people about this. Now, there'd be a name for it. Now we'd say, he was like polyamorous or like a sex addict or whatever it would be. Then, no one could believe that this sort of thing was going on. So it wasn't that he hid it from the people he was close to. He was always very open to them and very honest to them. And you never get any reports of him make him sound like predatory or sort of toxic in some way. It's always an awful lot of affection. He hurt a lot of people because he couldn't commit. But there's always an awful lot of affection for him as well. It's strange. It's a strange situation. He was a very interesting man, sort of Patrick Troughton. I assume none of the others had a similar life. I didn't find anything else like that about it. Thank you.
We've got one right there in front of you.
Mm-hmm.
Oh,
hello there.
Yeah, very interesting. I really like Doctor Who, yeah. And I remember 1968 in South Benfleet, the kids used to act Doctor Who, and they did it in York as well, same year.
Oh.
I moved up north, you see. But you were telling about the origin of Doctor Who. Mm. Well, one of its origins was a series called Quatermass.
Yeah.
You may have, there's 3 series, and it was filmed in Stanley-Hope, some of it was, at the Corium, Shellhaven. My mum worked there when they were filming it, and it was about 1960, 1961, about 1959. And that's where I think where they got Doctor Who from the sort of mysterious, the mist and the.
So much of Doctor Who comes from Quatermass.
Yes.
And I can see why Nigel Neal, who wrote Quatermass, really had a problem with Doctor Who. Mm. He was always very angry about it, or he'd say it was too much for children.
Yeah.
But they ripped off so much of his work. The first John Pertwee one was Quatermass 2, essentially. These things fall from the sky, and he's an integral part of the DNA, even though technically he's not, Nigel Neal. Yeah, and it's fascinating the way that when the BBC were creating Doctor Who, they were of the opinion that it was like science fiction was kind of beneath them. They sort of commissioned a bunch of reports to find out what science fiction was and whether they can make TV out of it and stuff. They'd never do that for like a comedy, or another type of program. And yet, Quatermass put British drama on the map, really, especially that first one, Rudolph Cartier, the director and stuff like that. That, moved drama away from, it's basically a play with a camera instead of an audience, to sort of what we know now. It was such a big part of the take-up of television and crucial series. But the BBC, they just sort of looked down on science fiction, and as Nigel Neal sort of found out, someone as talented as him. Yeah, absolute master.
Plastics as well, the daffodils that
Yeah.
That killed people in the medium wave, that's right, yeah.
Yes,
That's right.
that's right.
And Tom Baker, that was the golden age Doctor Who. Those first 4 Doctors, I think there was a golden age. Anyway,
Sorry, yes, thank you.
Okay,
Question
so
back
we've
there.
got actually 2 on this side. So one there, see the gentleman with the glasses. We'll have that one next, and then there's another one going to be here after that.
I'd be interested to know what your research has revealed about the hiatus between Sylvester McCoy, McCann, and then Russell Davies bringing it back with Christopher.
Yeah, I mean, it's an absolute crucial and fascinating period because you've got sort of... it's a slow 16-year change where the people who love the programme at the BBC, who are just starting out, their careers are slowly starting to rise. Like someone like Jane Tranter, who is now an executive producer of HBO's Succession, you know, big sort of thing like that. The thing that thrilled her most was in the Sylvester McCoy years, he got the job of marking up the rehearsal studio. So she'd come in at the weekend by herself, crawling around on this dusty floor, marking out where the TARDIS was, you know. She was delighted by this. She absolutely loved it. And obviously Russell T Davies was sort of starting out at this point. And, so slowly those people are gaining power and prestige and experience in the industry. And at the same time, the culture of the BBC that was the result of Michael Grade coming in that hated the programme. I mean, really hated it. I mean, where before Michael Grade came over to the BBC, when I think it was ITC, was he? He'd given interviews slagging off the BBC, and he singled out Doctor Who and Come Dancing, right, as the sort of deadwood that the BBC had to get rid of, right. These are obviously the crown jewels of the 21st century BBC. It's a clear, you know, he wasn't a man for spotting potential, for seeing, hey, if this thing, you know, had the right, you know, people and the right money and the right attention, this could be amazing. He didn't sort of see that. He sort of came in thinking, kind of like a Roman emperor. You know, it's his job to say yes or no to what should be on the BBC. And when you have a hierarchical organisation like the BBC, the prejudices of the person on top very quickly sort of spread to the people below them, usually in exaggerated, you know, ways. And so come the mid-1980s, the BBC just hated it. It just hated it. They would put programmes on about how terrible it was. They would talk about how poor the people making it were, like in radio interviews and stuff like that, in a way you can possibly imagine now. So it took that to sort of fall out of the BBC, those attitudes to fall away, the rise of those other people. And at the same time, the imaginative side of it all in the Virgin New Adventures books and things like that, and then the Paul McGann sort of stuff, was sort of showing, hey, this could be all sorts of other things, and all that sort of bubbling up. So it's a way that, you know, as I say, this character survives in a way it sort of shouldn't. It sort of stepped out of the TV into these books and continued sort of living and living until it got a point to get back on screen. Yeah, it's the Wilderness Years is fascinating time of it. Yeah.
So we had one there, but if you've got, and there's someone at the back there. We'll have that after the question from this side first.
It is me, isn't it? Yeah, sorry. Well, first of all, I thought it was really interesting. I guess this is more an observation rather than a question. But
we always expect.
Yeah, but I guess it feels at the moment, particularly with all the attacks from much of the right-wing press, it feels as if Doctor Who is almost a similar moment to what we had at the end of the classic series. You know, it's been almost predetermined that it's going to decline, or it is in decline. And I think it almost obscures the fact that Doctor Who has always had a very quite overt political element. You know, you have to go back to the 70s with, you know, episodes like The Green Death, discussions on the, you know, the UK joining the EEC, and, you know, kind of discussions on colonialism and so forth. So I think a lot of those kind of framings you get in much of the, you know, the Daily Mail and so forth, they don't really actually pay attention to what the history of Doctor Who actually is.
Yeah.
And it's more just a kind of anti, you know, woke standing point that it can, you know, take essentially.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, Doctor Who's been anti-fascist since 1963. Since that speech, was it January 64 maybe? It was the episode of the Daleks where Ian sort of lectures the Thals on how pacifism is no use in front of fascism. You just have to fight fascism, basically. That was there right at the start. So it's always sort of been there. And as I say, although it does change, it's more that it sort of accumulates, it sort of grows, it becomes more complex. Once ideas are in there, they very rarely sort of fall out. It does make sense that it has this sort of celebration of diversity and things like that. So when the country, or the world really, when the world's in the sort of the state it is, with, particularly in America, particularly with the Trump administration and how they're sort of behaving, the temptation might be to retreat from that. But that's not what Doctor Who is. Doctor Who has these values. So now, as much as I'd love it to be for everyone, you know, it feels a shame that some people it's not for me. It does feel a shame. But in the Trump era, of course it should be standing up for those values. That's at the heart of it. You know, it would not be Doctor Who if it wasn't sort of doing that sort of thing. And because it's doing it, it sort of sheds light on all the other things that aren't, you know, all the other things that are acquiescing. So it's impact in the culture and stuff like that is very important, yes.
So there's a person up there who had their hand up for quite a while. Sorry, it's over on that side. There's a young woman there who's had her hand up for ages. And then we can come to the gentleman there.
Hello.
What's your favourite episode?
Do you know Pyramids of Mars? Do you know that one? It's probably because it's the first one I can remember. But there was something about the atmosphere. I mean, it was spooky. It was very, very spooky. I was 4. I was too young. It blew my mind. And even though it's oddly unfunny, for that era Tom Baker, there's no humour in it at all, it still just takes me back. I just absolutely love that episode. But more recently, the 11th Hour has got to be up there. Day of the Doctor was kind of special as well. Yeah, we're not spoilt for good ones. Basically, we've got many options. Yes.
So it's this gentleman, and this unfortunately is going to have to be the last question if we're going to have time for book signings. So, please.
Doctor Who started off as being fantasy and humour. Here.
Oh yes, sorry.
And effectively took us to places where our imagination could run riot, and we enjoyed it. As it started to, or the writers started to put in emphasis of real life, and we're talking about some of the things that are deemed to be woke now, the joy of Doctor Who, the fun of Doctor Who and all the rest of it seemed to diminish. I think a lot of people, as you said, start to watch a series hoping that some of that will come back. And when they find out it hasn't, they start to switch off again. Do you think that's true or not true?
Yes, and I mean, I think the special thing at the heart of Doctor Who, I mean, it's amazing the way it sets fire to the imagination of you as a child. But the way it does it is it's not just, it's always connected to here and now, and it just shows you everything else beyond that. You know, that link to the modern world. As many fans will say, oh, we should have alien companions, and we should, you know, have companions with parts of history and things like that. And as a fan, you sort of go, yeah, that would mix it up, that would be good. But it's something about that collision between your life and everything beyond your life that I think is at the heart of it. Certainly when it has its golden ages, like the Dalek Mania era, or the early 70s, or the late 2000s, it's always got human sort of companions with it at a certain point. And it has to, every now and again, it has to, because it's most of its audience is older, is adults, and it always has been. But if it loses touch with the children of the day, then it's doomed. That's the one, it must always sort of keep hold of that. And the programme can drift older and older and older in its audience, as it did with the Peter Capaldi years. But then every now and then it has to rewrite itself. It has to bring in a Sylvester McCoy. And I think the Ncuti Gatwa series that you're talking about now it's definitely a desire to get the 7-year-olds again. The way the Ncuti's doctor is so emotional, you know, he's always weeping or beaming or laughing. His emotions are on the surface. It's a very sort of childlike sort of thing. It's something that can be identified with. And things like, you know, the Eurovision episode was, you've got to say that was fun, you know, or looks. You've got these things are sort of fun, but they are about the world that the 7 and 8-year-olds are sort of entering. You know, the stuff about the remark about planets of the incels. You know, they are connected to the anger that the Doctor had about a conspiracy grifter in the Lucky Day episode. The fury he had of this. This is the world that they're growing up into. So it is aimed very much at those people in that world, and it has to be the one program that does what no other program can. You know, when they were coming out of the TV, you ain't going to get that in Star Wars. It's a different thing. When I was growing up, there was just really Doctor Who and maybe Blake 7. So of course we all watched it. It's very different, you know, landscape. It has to sort of, it has to have something that connects with those young ones again, which I think it's been trying to do so much, at possibly, you know, the expense of people like me, older sort of people sometimes. You know, the Space Babies one with the talking babies and the farting spaceship and stuff like that probably wasn't aimed at, you know, the 4-quarter audience, as they say. Things like that were aimed a bit sort of younger. But I do know it has to do that. It has to do that every now and again. So I've probably rambled far away from your question, but what you say you hear a lot, and I do sort of understand it, but it does feel part of the natural change and evolution of it to me. So I think it's, you know, I think it's right that it can disconnect slightly from people for other reasons. That probably makes no sense. There you go.
Okay, so the final question here at the front.
Oh, yes.
Do you think you have to watch all of the Doctors to enjoy Doctor Who?
No. You don't have to, but if you do, there comes a point in your life when you go, I should do the marathon, shouldn't I? I should start at An Unearthly Child, 1963. And it's going to take so many years. And you watch it all. And everyone I know who's done it is like, I'm so glad I did that. You just sort of see, not the series change, but the country change, the world change. It's phenomenal to see the programme in that light, in this sort of constant sort of thing. So I'd heartily recommend it. And I'd heartily recommend it happening. But the thing is, ain't no rules with this sort of thing. You know, you just do what you enjoy. You don't feel pressured into, oh, I've got to see a black and white one or anything like that if it's not for you. Just watch what you like. But at some point that thought might cross your mind. Just to say. Thank you all so much for listening. Thank you for coming.